Next, we'd like to invite Brooke Weitzman to come to represent the legal perspective. She is the directing attorney and the co-founder of the Elder Law Disability Rights Center.
I was really excited to inspire you all about what you were going to do, and then I realized I was going after someone who inspires people for a living, and I'll see what I can do. So we have a housing crisis in Orange County, right? You're all here because you know that education, healthcare, everything from mental health to sobriety, seniors aging in place, right? These are all things that are dependent upon housing that we cannot solve without having housing. And when I say housing, while I spend a lot of my time fighting for emergency shelters because we have hundreds of people dying in the street, I don't mean emergency shelters, I mean housing. That we're developing these emergency shelters, which are critical, and we need to do that, but that they should be just that, emergencies. They should be a place a person goes for a few days or a month while we figure out what is the appropriate placement, and we can't do that until we have the housing. So we know that morally, that financially, that when you look at the religious perspective, the humane perspective, the social perspective, that all roads, that the evidence-based solution at the end of every road is housing. So that leads us to why aren't we there, right? Why don't we have the housing? And that's where the legal comes in. So we looked around and said, what's the problem? Why aren't we getting the housing? Why aren't the developers being able to develop at the pace they need to? Why aren't politicians passing these projects? And what we saw was that homeless people were desperate for help, but were being labeled service resistant. That was the term that was used when law enforcement said, "Can I give you a ride to Santa Ana?" And they said no. And so that was so then we said, well, what can we do from the legal perspective to try and free this up? It looks like in Orange County we have immense wealth that most other counties don't have. And we have lots of land that's not developed, and I know no one wants their neighborhood heavily developed, but we have space. We have buildings that are empty that could house people. We have motels that are empty that could be rehabilitated into single occupancy rooms. And so we had the space and we had the money, and we still weren't getting anything approved, and it quickly became clear that what we don't have is the political will to do these things. That we did not have brave political leaders who were willing to take an unpopular stance or to put in the hard work to educate their communities about what they needed to do and why they needed to do it, or to just go ahead and do it anyway and hope that the results would be enough to get them reelected. Because politics are hard, right? Like, there is a fine line between doing what's right and doing what you can while still remaining elected, because if you don't get elected again, you do nothing. And so we stepped in and said, okay, we're going to start holding these cities and this county and our governments accountable to respecting the Constitution. That we all have constitutional rights, that I think it's important to everyone in this room that your constitutional rights are respected, and in the same way, it was important to us that the constitutional rights of the poorest and most vulnerable members of our community and of our seniors were respected. And what that meant, what the courts had already decided, was it is unconstitutional to criminalize unavoidable behavior. That for a person who has no choice but to be outside because you haven't offered them housing or shelter or anywhere to go, that it violates the Constitution to then put them in jail, saying it's criminal to camp, it's criminal to loiter, it's criminal to panhandle. And so we started bringing cases locally, and that's kind of what led to this broader litigation that we have now, and asked the federal court to turn to all of our local governments and say, you can't enforce any of those, what we call quality of life ordinances. You can't criminalize behaviors that people can't avoid unless and until you have provided adequate alternatives. And that means keeping families together, right? If we asked a house person to separate from their spouse, they would probably say no. So why on earth did we think it was okay to ask all the homeless people to separate from their spouse, to be permitted to sleep in an open space shelter? If we asked those of you who have pets to separate from your pet, it would probably take a significant emotional toll, and you might say no. And so why on earth were we asking homeless individuals, the people who had experienced the most trauma, who were the most emotionally dependent upon the animal that had been with them the whole time, to separate from their pets? And so we said, to be adequate, to be legally sufficient, the placements have to be appropriate and they have to be available, that we have to take a healthcare first approach, which means actually bringing clinicians out into the field and not just law enforcement. which means figuring out what people's medical needs were and how we were going to develop solutions that met them. And so through those demands that the Constitution be respected, that people not be incarcerated because of poverty, we found ourselves in this unique kind of perfect storm of the work of the United Way on demonstrating the economics of housing first, seeing a few other places in the country that had started to implement housing first and really demonstrate that there is success every time this housing first model is taken, that we had the commitment of some of the local developers to build the permanent supportive housing, to just find the projects and start working on them and trust that the funding would come through eventually. And then we started seeing the state turning to housing and saying, wait a second, if cities aren't in line with their housing element, their state required obligation to consider the needs of their community and to zone for the needs of their community, that the state is going to take a stance and find that unacceptable. And we had a judge saying, you're right, we can't criminalize this behavior. And that left many of the cities, and we started in North County, with no choice but to start looking at solutions. So they did. They started approving projects. They started, rather than turning to service providers and saying, we don't want you here, we don't need you here, those homeless aren't from here and they're not our problem, because obviously it's Santa Ana's problem. They started saying, wait a second, what is it going to cost us to get a solution? How much? Is there a way that we can fund this without using our local dollars? Is there other money we can use? And the answer was yes, right? That there is Mental Health Service Act funding, that there is a variety of forms of state and federal funding. And that when we did start looking to those reports about the economics, we saw that maybe we needed to get healthcare funding. That cities would say to us, you know, you're telling me I need to spend money because it's better for my tax-paying residents and it's better for my community, but you're also telling me that if I spend that money, that the people who are going to save money are healthcare and law enforcement and kind of parks and all of these other departments that are not the ones spending the money. So maybe we need to look at how we can get them to start spending the money. And we did. So we saw Orange County's CalOptima approve spending $100 million of its reserves on homeless healthcare. We still are going to see what that looks like, right? We don't know. But we saw Orange County say we're going to start taking mobile healthcare units out. We're going to start working to make social services more available. And so we're kind of at this point where now we need to turn to the rest of our politicians and figure out what is it going to take to make them take the same steps. Right? That a few of these North County cities showed us that while housing may take time, coming up with some minimum standard of shelter that allows people a little bit of privacy, a little bit of dignity, can be done in a matter of weeks. That they can take a warehouse and they can build it out with single cubicles, they can put in beds, and they can do it very quickly. And all of the cities in the county have a warehouse somewhere they could do that with, right? We don't need to start from scratch. All of the cities have a motel or a building that could be rehabbed quickly. And so that's where all of you come in, right? That's the space where all of you can turn to your local governments who are hearing from a very loud, very small, and slightly violent minority that is saying, we do want them to die in our streets, that we don't care if 250 people a year die in our streets. We don't care if we didn't know their names. And you have the space to go to your local governments and say, in fact, we do care, we're going to re-elect you if you do the right thing, that we want to be on the side of history that says we saved lives and we saved money and that we got in front of this housing crisis, not be the city that's at the top of the list for wasting the most money fighting solutions, right? And so pushing your local governments to make those evidence-based choices when it comes both to housing, to transitional housing, to emergency shelter options, to the ways in which those shelters will operate, right, to making sure that they do keep families together, that they do provide on-site services, and then for regular affordable housing, right? So we talk a lot about permanent supportive housing, which is the option for people who are limited to disability, who are not going to be employable, who are getting $850 a month and are never going to get any more than that, and they're from our community and should stay in our community. But we also have people who are working, and we have seniors who maybe don't need that level of on-site supportive services, but do need affordable housing. And so the thing that I think you all know because you're here, but I like to remind people, is that when you develop housing and you take the homeless folks in your neighborhood and you put them in the housing, there's no more homeless people. There's no trick, right? The solution is real straightforward. It's people in housing are housed, They're not. So people in shelters are still homeless people, but people in housing are just neighbors. And neighbors are great. They contribute to your local economies and your community. That when you go to these homeless communities, there are strong communities that work hard to look out for each other. And those are people who are going to add value to your communities if you figure out a safe way to let them, and that is housing. I'm not sure. So I was just checking my time. I didn't see my flash. So the call to all of you is to speak up, right? To go to your local communities. To when you see those terrifying conversations on Nextdoor that say, "Let's go light them on fire," respond. Because if you stay silent in today's society, that you're choosing not to engage. And if you want to be a part of the solution and you want to organize as part of the solution, you need to speak to the people you've elected. You need to make them know that they'll be reelected if they do the right thing. And you need to speak to your neighbors and help them learn what the evidence is about solutions.